The reason that goes, it's difficult for people to get their head around is we sort of want to think about those schizophrenics and us normal people. But we don't
Yeah.
realize we all have thousands of genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. It's just if you have 10,000 of the risk factors, you're more likely to be schizophrenic. But even then, it doesn't mean that you will be schizophrenic. It's probabilistic. And people have trouble
Yeah.
with that. Well, up until the recent Diagnostic Statistic Manual 5, you couldn't be schizophrenic and bipolar. That was the first division in um, uh, the structure of psychiatric disorders. But then when we did the first, what they're called genome-wide association studies to find the genes for these disorders, and this is in 2000, late 2000s, 2007 and 2010, the genes that come up for schizophrenia as most related to schizophrenia, the same genes come up for bipolar. And now what we know is that instead of these disorders being genetically different, about the correlation between them genetically is on the order of 0.6. They're highly correlated genetically. And so
Yeah.
that means that etiologically, they're not these distinct disorders, even though they look very different, and all of our work is mostly at that phenotypic level. But at this first causal level of genetics, they don't look like they're different disorders. And then, more generally, most psychiatric disorders have many genes in common. They correlate
Yeah.
genetically. And that's really important then, to realize that there's kind of a general genetic disposition towards psychopathology, but it's less a matter of one specific disorder or another. So that's really big. This is just in the last few years. So
This
that's
is
another
a
example of what
huge
we get out of
point.
these studies. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have, this was a really interesting point that I also picked up in the book. I have a quote from Blueprint that I think really well summarizes what you just said, which is, what we call disorders are merely the extremes of the same genes that work throughout the normal distribution. That is, there are no genes for any psychological disorder. I had to reread this a couple of times, and it is worth restating. There are no genes for any psychological disorder. Instead, we all have many of the DNA differences that are related to those disorders. The salient question is how many of these we have. I think this is another very powerful idea that does not have very much penetration in the general population. This is not really, I think, the mental model that people have for psychopathology. You know, they have some, like autism clearly means there's a distinct difference in the brain. There's one difference and you either have it or you don't. And you can
Yes.
say that about every psychopathology. Talk about that a bit more because I think it's incredibly important.
Well, the bumper sticker for this chapter in the book, Blueprint, is the abnormal is normal. That is, the differences, as
Yeah,
you just
which I
said in
love.
that quote, is they're quantitative, not qualitative. They're a matter of more or less rather than either or. But because of the medical model, where you either have COVID or you don't, and we say if you have the SARS virus, you've got COVID. So that's going back to like single genes and single causes of things, which, is a lot of what medical progress has been about. But we're not, it's not relevant to these common disorders, whether they're medical, cardiovascular, or whatever, or psychiatric. Now that we found genes that predict risk for, say, schizophrenia, it's not that they're people that it's not at all even bimodal, let alone, um, you know, uh, ideologically completely distinct. If you look at the genes that affect schizophrenia and you assign people scores on the basis of how many of those risk factors they have genetically, called a polygenic score, a multiple gene score, where we're adding up the effects of thousands of single gene, little single gene effects, you find that distribution is perfectly normal. That is, there's no break point at which people become schizophrenic. It's just quantitative. It's a matter of more or less. And the reason that goes, it's difficult for people to get their head around is we sort of want to think about those schizophrenics and us normal people. But we don't
Yeah,
realize we all have thousands of genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. It's just if you have 10,000 of the risk factors, you're more likely to be schizophrenic. But even then, it doesn't mean that you will be schizophrenic. It's probabilistic. And people have trouble
Yeah.
with that, partly because of that single gene thing, where we all learn about genetics. But it is such an important point. It's different from the point we were just making about the genetic correlation between traits. But this is
Yeah.
probably an even more important point for people to realize, that the abnormal is normal, in the sense that it's a normal distribution of risk. It isn't qualitative, but rather quantitative. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up.
So
That's a good point.
I think it's a good one to talk about for a while, just because it's so important in today's world. And again, just not a thing that I think is very penetrative in society. We don't talk about psychopathologies in this way. So much so that it seems like we have this huge misalignment between the system we have for diagnosing people, our diagnostic system, which is fundamentally qualitative. You have this marker or you don't. You have the label, you don't have the label.
Exactly.
I think it's almost like just a problem we have with language in general, that it doesn't work here. But how do we get closer to aligning this quantitative idea of how genes contribute towards outside of the normal distribution, behavioral phenotypes, and then diagnostics? Like,
Yeah.
how do we connect those two so that we're able to appropriately diagnose people, and if they need help, get that help?
Yeah. So first, I'd like to say that I'm not saying there aren't behavioral problems. There is. People like in my area of learning disabilities, some kids have trouble learning to read. But what I would ask is, what do we gain from pretending that there's a disorder, a disability, reading disability, to medicalize it even more, give it a Greek or a Latin name, call it dyslexia. So it
Yeah.
sounds like, oh, my child has dyslexia, so that explains everything. It doesn't explain anything. Kids differ in how
Yeah.
easily they learn to read, and some kids have a lot of problems learning to read. I'm not denying that there's the reading problem. I'm just asking, what do we gain by diagnosing them and saying they have it and the rest don't? No, there's a lot of kids who have reading problems just as bad as the kid who was diagnosed, So it's thinking about
Exactly.
it quantitatively has to help us. But it also has the downside, especially nowadays, I find. Everyone wants to have a disorder. I had a friend who called me, a 50-year-old guy who was all excited because he says, God, I figured out why my life is fucked up. I was just diagnosed as ADHD. And that
Oh God.
explains
Okay.
everything, And
Yeah.
I had to tell him, that really doesn't explain anything. You're just a jerk, and you're not nice to people. But that's why they like a diagnosis, because they say, that's it. Now I understand myself.
Yeah.
But it's just so
Agency
wrong.
thrown away. Not my
Terrible.
fault. It's not my
Yeah.
fault. Yeah.
And with ADHD, kids they differ in attention. They differ in how active they are. If they had the hyperactivity ADHD diagnosis when I was a kid, I definitely would have had it. Because in those days, in the Catholic school system in Chicago, we were stuck in these train track chairs that are, in a row like in a train. And, you don't move during the day. If you're squirming around or you're getting bored or whatever, that's what makes you ADHD. But I do think getting out in the real world, a lot of ADHD characteristics are quite positive, like the
Yeah.
attentional problems. You take an ADHD kid and get them involved in a video game or something they're really keen on, they don't have an attention problem. They have a boredom problem,
Yeah.
more than anything. And similarly with hyperactivity, being active in a sense of energy has to be a very big factor in success in life. So
Absolutely.
anyway, I think I can see why people like the diagnosis idea. They like it for their kids because you got that label and, okay, that's why my kid's not good at school. He's dyslexic. But it's a false comfort also in understanding our...
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then I'm so confident you will enjoy even more the full conversation. You can click it here. Click it. Come on. You know you want to. Click it.